time for your questions, comments. You already have my website, and I mentioned that every summer at our research group at Harvard, we have an institute. This summer we actually have 2 institutes where we go into these issues in more depth. The institutes are filled, but they'll be next year. So if you have, yes, gentlemen in the third row. I think you were raising, in part, the question about how to use knowledge, what to do with it. Okay, I think I understand the general territory of your remarks, which sound very knowledgeable. First of all, I do think that I'm a developmentalist, and so my barns are based upon a notion of a sequence. And yet, not everything is sequential. Some things are systemic. And even though it may seem sequential to me, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it's experienced by others, or even that that's exactly how it happens. And indeed, probably in education, as Bruner said, there are some things which are understood quite early, and there are other things which, even after lots of immersion, are not particularly well understood. You're also raising the question of what do we do and how do we decide what to do? These are essentially value judgments, and I gave you some very strong values, namely, certain disciplines are very important. I mentioned 4: history, science, math, and art. And I argued that you should pick a few topics and go into them with a lot of depth. You might have a different philosophy. In fact, most examinations ask for people to have a lot of knowledge about many different topics and don't go very much into depth in any of them. And then we would have to have a debate, a discussion about the reasons why I favor what I favor and why you might favor something different. What makes us decide what to focus on and what to ignore? I think that it isn't only our value system, it's what happens in the world. When I wrote the book, The Disciplinary Mind, I was pretty critical of interdisciplinary work. But I came to realize 10, 12 years ago that much of the work now in the world is interdisciplinary, and much of the work should be interdisciplinary. And so that caused me to focus on something now that I would have ignored 10 years ago because of my own new understanding of what's valued. In mathematics in many countries, we continue to teach algebra, geometry, trigonometry, and pre-calculus, which is how it was done 100 years ago. I would certainly argue for the vast majority of people, understanding statistics, probability, knowing how to compute a mortgage, how to invest your money, how to fill out a tax form, are much, much more important, and people are not taught that. That's a set of values, and it has to do with the way that history changes. I used a lot of examples today from economics because everybody has been thinking about economics recently because of what's happened in the world. Is this at all relevant to what you're asking, or did I miss the point? Yes, woman in the third row? Okay. Domain and discipline are actually words for which I have my own definition. Domain is a broad category. It covers any activity in which you can evaluate people in terms of expertise. So any art, any craft, any occupation, and any academic discipline is a domain. Is a domain, right. A discipline is just one kind of domain. It's an academic, scholarly area where people with a certain kind of expertise make the same basic assumptions. Also, when they argue within the same framework, so to speak. So discipline is an academic domain. Every once in a while, disciplines undergo a revolution. It's what we call a paradigm change. And when a discipline has a paradigm change, the people who learned the discipline before cannot communicate with the new people. This happened most dramatically with quantum mechanics in physics. Einstein believed ultimately we could give a determinative explanation for everything in the physical world. Quantum mechanics said no. There are certain unknowables. And Einstein famously said, God does not play dice with the world. This doesn't mean that Einstein believed in God. It means that he didn't believe in chance. He believed there was a reason. But that was an argument within the domain, within the discipline of physics. Physics is one of 100 domains in the society. When you said fourth grade slump, I actually thought you were asking about reading, because it's well documented in many parts of the world. The first years of reading are simply devoted to being able to know each word and how to say it. And children learn that in the first few years. But then, when reading has to be automatic so that they can actually understand what the text says without paying too much attention to words, many students fall down. And that's a tremendous problem. I haven't heard the term fourth year slump or fourth grade slump to creativity, but I believe what you're referring to is that in most places, when children become 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age, they're less adventurous. They're less willing to take risks and to just let their imagination go wherever it wants to go. And I mentioned yesterday that this is a natural occurrence all over the world, even where there isn't school. And the reason it occurs is after the children have developed their own theories, they become curious about what the right answer is. And so they look to adults, to laws, to conventions to tell them how to behave and how to think. And that's normal, and probably it's good because we don't want to have a chaotic world. But the cost of that is that even if the child might have some wild thoughts, he's less likely to express them, and maybe eventually he's less likely to think them. And so what appears to be a slump lasts forever. In people who are more artistic or more scientifically creative, it may be a slump, but then there's a rise again later. And we have speculated about why that's the case. The point I made yesterday is that teachers and parents can keep creativity alive by emphasizing, by two things. One, being willing themselves to take unusual views and be playful, not always be strict and orthodox, but also by spending time trying to understand what children say, even if it isn't, quote unquote, the right answer, to show that it can be taken seriously. So I don't think you can eliminate the slope, but you can make it less and help going back up. Eric? The word was how students can learn to self-regulate. Yeah. I think you're right. That is a separate area. I mean, you could have a lot of self-regulation without particularly having disciplinary understanding. Whether you could have disciplinary understanding without self-regulation is more problematic. One of the things you and I were talking about during the break, which will certainly be focused on this afternoon, is there's a huge difference between education 100 years ago and education today. In my father's time and your grandparents' or great-grandparents' time, people went to school for 5, 10, 12 years, and then they could kind of live pretty much on what they'd learned because jobs were pretty stable. The world changed, but it didn't change at warp speed. And maybe occasionally you would have a refresher course of some sort. But now all of us need to be lifelong learners. It's not even controversial. The only difference is whether we enjoy lifelong learning, and most of you would not be here on a Saturday or Sunday unless you got some pleasure out of it, or whether you dread lifelong learning, but you have to do it to satisfy somebody else's edict. I'm, as I said, German by background, and whatever that means otherwise, self-regulation is something I learned from my mother's milk. One of the most famous experiments that's been widely quoted is Walter Mischel's study of 4-year-olds in Stanford University in the preschool 30 years ago, where the children were sat in a room with marshmallows, that's a candy, and they said, I'm going out of the room, and you can have the candy now, but if you wait till I come back, you can have 2 candies. And amazingly, 15 years later, the students who self-regulated, but didn't immediately reach the candy, did better in their college tests and so on. So it's much easier if you have that by the age of 4. However, it's not something that one can count on, and probably a great deal of time now is spent by educators in helping young people to regulate what they ought to be regulating on their own. I was very impressed visiting Japan many years ago in a preschool, and maybe it was the first grade, children 5 or 6. And if one child acts up, nobody gets to go out for recess. That means nobody gets out to play. It's a very powerful message on that child not to act up. And I guess what I'm saying is the earlier self-regulation becomes something that is taken for granted because it's been achieved, the easier much of education is. Except, and this goes back to the creativity question, you shouldn't have too much regulation about your imagination, because that's where the new ideas come from. Sibel, do you want to read a couple questions before the break? Okay. The question is, can we learn about how to implement multiple intelligences in schools? The answer is there is a huge literature from all over the world by people who have created programs or schools which use multiple intelligences ideas. Most of them are in English, but there certainly are other languages. Somebody here earlier showed me a book in Turkish about multiple intelligences in school. Is that person here? Yes. Okay, so there's somebody right there. What is your name? Norpent? Okay, well, I hope other people could hear. I'll just mention two books. In 2004, Mindy Kornhaber published a book called Multiple Intelligences, where she reviewed 41 schools in the United States which implemented multiple intelligences ideas. And in 2009, Jackie Chen is issuing a book called Multiple Intelligences Around the World, which describes projects in schools in many different countries. So there's a huge literature. I don't particularly recommend one approach over another. That's really up to you. I want to make a few comments. I think that the idea of multiple intelligences is powerful, and it has had a liberating effect in education all over, and I'm very pleased and humbled by that. With the passage of time, I am more interested in promoting recognition of the plurality of intelligences, that there are a number of intelligences, than in saying that I have the story exactly right. In fact, I'm sure that parts of what I said are not going to turn out to be the best way to describe our different mental faculties, and that's fine with me. So maybe there isn't a naturalist intelligence. Maybe it's better described as a logical kind of intelligence superimposed upon sensory systems, and that would be fine with me. Also, I was hoping to find a neurological structure connected to existential intelligence, but the more that I read, and this goes up to last week, the more convinced I am that the relevant neural structures, infratemporal lobe structures, are really more close to religious and spiritual experience than to the big questions, the existential questions that I'm interested in. But I think existential intelligence is a useful concept, so I'm going to continue to use it anyway, even though I don't have the neural evidence that I would like. So the first comment is, hooray for multiple intelligences, but Howard Gardner doesn't care that much whether he has the ultimate description of each intelligence. The second point is that clearly these ideas are examined differently for different audiences. There's a philosopher in England named John White who has spent half of his career attacking my definition of intelligence from the point of view of philosophy. If I want to answer John White, I have to become a philosopher. A lot of my work, as you know, is oriented toward education, and educators are not interested in the neurophysiology, the neuroscience, by and large. They just aren't. They would like to think that the intelligences are sensible and that they can use them for teaching and for assessing. And that's largely the audience being addressed today. Personally, like you, I'm extremely interested in the neural and the genetic basis of the intelligences. And I have a few students whom I've encouraged to take on what you've described, namely to bring a book that's 27 years old up to date in terms of the neurology of the several intelligences. I don't run a dictatorship, and if they want to do that, it's up to them. I'm not going to make them do it. But I already mentioned yesterday, I don't know whether you were here, that there are at least a few things where I was quite wrong neurologically. First of all, the intelligences are much more specific than I would have thought. There are many facets of spatial intelligence. There are many facets of musical intelligence. There are many facets of linguistic intelligence, and these have separate neurological representations. But if I had written about 50 intelligences, we couldn't communicate. So I just call them sub-intelligences, and that's actually mentioned in my first book. Number two, the human brain is much more flexible, much more plastic than any of us anticipated. A young person who grows up in one environment will have quite different representations, mental and neural, than ones who grew up in other environments. If you become deaf, the auditory parts of your brain become dedicated to other kinds of sensory input, primarily visual. As you probably know, if you spend a lot of time learning a skill, you have quite different cortical representations than if you don't develop the skill. And the nature of the skill determines the cortical representation. The third thing, which is truly amazing, and I mentioned yesterday, was discovered by Antonio Batro, who is one of the scientific committee here. Batro is a neurologist. He studied 2 young boys who had an entire hemisphere removed from their brain. So half the brain was removed. This was because of epilepsy, not because of scientific curiosity. And Batro wrote a book called Half a Brain is Enough, because even in half a brain, you can have the full range of intelligences. I never thought that was possible. To me, that would have been science fiction, completely imagination. So, apologies to those of you who are not into these neurological speculations. The point is that education changes very slowly. Our scientific findings in the area of genetics and neurology change enormously quickly. I'm going to speak about that this afternoon. So, to the extent that I'm interested in a scientific basis for multiple intelligences, that's a job where I have to keep up. But if I can't, I hope other people will. I think we're eating into your lunchtime, so probably I'll take a look at the questions at lunch and maybe mention a few in the afternoon. We start at what time? What time, Sibel, this afternoon? 2 o'clock, so have a good... Okay, so see you this afternoon, I hope.